themes, such as home occupations and what that looks like in Englewood, and just some lighter, easier things maybe to talk about in a short amount of time on December 7th. So I did send out a map and some language that the planning staff worked with City Council and the Planning and Zoning Commission on. Probably a year and a half to 2 years ago, and we had multiple meetings on bulk plane and dimensional standards for neighborhoods and new builds. And so we took a tour with City Council, and I included the tour map for you if you wanted to sort of on your own take a look at what we discussed, and we provided some lot information for each of those houses or duplexes. And so hopefully that gave you a sampling of what some of the things that we were looking at then and we're still looking at as part of this process. So hopefully that helped sort of frame tonight's conversation. Hopefully it might have triggered some questions for you all to bring up. But other than that, also be thinking about in your own perspective, what does a neighborhood mean to you? What characteristics of a neighborhood do you particularly like? How do you define it? There's many ways to define the character of a neighborhood. So as we go through, as Chris gives his presentation, just keep that in the back of your mind, and we'll share some thoughts as to what that means to you towards the end of the meeting. So enough for me. I will turn it over to Chris.
Thank you, Wade, and good evening, everyone. I'm going to share my screen here, and thanks for that introduction. I'm going to be able to skip the first couple slides because of it. So let me get to full screen here.
Sorry to steal your thunder there.
No stealing the thunder. That's good. Good context, and I really appreciate it. So that's the where we've been, and as Wade mentioned, we're hitting the 5 priority areas from the code assessment in this preliminary discussion as we were kind of paralleling our own independent diagnosis of the code there in phase 1, which is now stretching a little bit, but we'll begin to go deeper into some of these topics and beyond these topics. I know there's probably some issues that many of you have on your mind that are beyond these 5 priority areas, and we will get to those too as we begin to get more into the broader public engagement or deeper in public engagement on particular issues. But all of that's an introduction that what we're trying to do in these first few months is set us up to begin drafting potential solutions or range of options beginning next year. So we haven't begun that task yet. So just a heads up of when you'll begin to see some of those things. So tonight we kind of lumped 2 things together from the priority topics, the idea of housing options, and then particularly the way it's talked about in the code assessment, if you're familiar with that document, in terms of just revisiting the lot and dimension standards for all of your zoning districts, but then also neighborhood character and how those 2 things are interrelated. Your plan, Englewood Forward from 2016, talks a lot about these issues, and mainly the overall theme that's coming through is prioritizing neighborhood design and distinct identities of neighborhoods, and sometimes different identities in different neighborhoods, getting better housing options to meet different lifestyle choices, more resiliency for the long term, how that affects attainability and affordability of housing, and then overall putting that diverse range of housings in a context that's valuable, mainly in terms of connecting land use and transportation, more walkable, bikeable, and transit supported neighborhoods due to the city's kind of strategic context and larger scale investments. And then so what does that mean? How do we balance all those competing, not necessarily competing, but sometimes competing issues? If it's talking about change, obviously that's going to tax the character and identity of some neighborhoods. If it's talking about maintaining certain scale and building form, that's going to tax some of the housing options. And so we're trying to hit that right balance. So I'm going to go through a little bit about your current code and how we look at it as the outsider's perspective, in line with some of those goals. It's certainly not the answer, and definitely not the answer yet, and may not be the answer depending on your all's discussion. But one of the things we do like to look at when we have a community looking for housing options is taking more of what we call a building type approach. And so that's regulating development more on specific categories and types of buildings that you think fit into your community, and less on district-wide standards, because different building types demand different form and lot standards. And sometimes those can fit in, not all the time, but sometimes they can all fit in even when you allow a mix. And so that's one thing to keep in mind. Your development code does show some semblance of already starting to do this. And so our question is, do we need to tweak some things? Do we need to go further? Which districts would we choose to go further, and how would they be used? All of those questions are kind of on the table. And so what we're talking about, the building, those numbers that you see in those diagrams, they convert to things that we can easily evaluate and say, does this fit in, or does this not fit in? And those are some of the engagement things we plan on doing with specific projects and examples later on as we get into the issues. But tonight's just more of a preliminary introduction to that approach and how we might want to be thinking about some of these issues. This is a quick summary. We do this sort of analysis of all of your residential zoning districts. And so a lot of numbers here. So don't necessarily need to decipher it, but the quick takeaway is that what I mentioned before is you already are starting to have some of this building type approach integrated into your code, but there's some areas where we've noticed some potential issues with that. And it largely deals with what we'll talk about further is when we look at the distinctions between different zoning districts and what one zoning district enables versus another. That's the key element we want to pry on to figure out if these districts are all working well together. But essentially, you can see on the right, the way your code's set up, if you're not familiar with it, is you have 3 R1 districts, which are primarily single family districts, and they just allow different lot sizes the further up you go. 2 R2 districts, which begin to introduce multifamily buildings, but just the lower end of that scale, the duplex, and then another type of multifamily building in the R2B. And we have some kind of questions or thoughts about that. And then the last category is for the higher density, more purely multifamily building types, and some different districts and scales of buildings there. Again, going back to your comprehensive plan goals, one of the terms that is used in the planning profession now that I'm sure many of you heard of is this idea of missing middle housing. And so when we think of that, it's these types right here in the middle. And the why they're called missing middle is they're sort of they're defined as small scale, smaller lot, multi-unit buildings. So the buildings, and sometimes it's referred to, another jargon term is gentle density. It's a building pattern and a building type that fits in well with a lot of neighborhoods, certainly not all neighborhoods, but they mix in well. But when you do the math on them, their density is actually very high. The reason for that is they put a small building on a smaller lot, but you put 4, 5, 6 units in it, all of a sudden the density number goes up. So this is a rough chart we use to look at what some of those densities may be and why they're missing. Sometimes we have density numbers working against these projects. So the types of projects that could fit into your neighborhood don't fit in well with the development code. And there's a little bit of that going on in your code, but certainly not a lot comparatively. We've done other cities where they truly are missing. There's just no possible way to get them done. And that's not so much the case in your code, but we'll walk through it a little bit here. Your R1 districts, again, you're going to hit those. It's mainly for detached houses and single family living, and at a range of lot sizes, you're starting to hit that 5 to 7.5 dwelling units per acre, which again, translating it to your broader goals of transit supportive, walkable, and mixed density neighborhoods. That's a pretty good range. Single family homes can support walkable commercial. They can be transit supportive when they're upper end of that range, and especially so when they mix in with other districts. So there's not too many issues in your R1 neighborhoods other than how they're used and some things nuances we might want to distinguish between them. When we graduate up to the R2 districts, that's where we start to see a little bit of the issues. There's a 3,000 square foot per unit lot size requirement, and easily gets the duplex and the smaller lot houses in. But it's the multi-unit house where you start to add more and more units to the house that can start to become a little more limited just because of that cap. And is that something we want to look at in your R2 districts? And then moving up to the first of the R3, the MU 3A, it still retains that 3,000 square foot cap per unit. So essentially on the left side, we don't gain anything with that district by allowing a more of a multifamily building. You'll start to see things creeping in on the right side. We call those kind of more suburban format. Like it's an anomaly that density can sometimes push multifamily projects in the wrong pattern. So you see the far right there is apartment complexes. Some of those large suburban complexes, they don't fit in well in a lot of contexts, yet their density number is low because they have such a large land base, even though they're multifamily. So at 14.5 units per acre, you're starting to push things to that type of format. And it won't, and as a built out community with a really established block structure, those projects won't fit in very well at all. It's a very suburban format. Then moving up to your R3B, the density numbers go up because of now when you get over 4 units, you are only required to have 1,000 square feet of lot area for each additional unit. So the density number goes up to anywhere between 20 and 25 in units per acre in most typical formats. So now we do start to see the multi-unit house come in, but you can start to see that on the other side, the more suburban apartment complexes are becoming more of, that's the range they're usually in. And then the other thing to note is it's still difficult to do a row house or a walk-up apartment at those ranges, and they don't really fit in quite well. You can start to do them, but they don't fit in quite as well. And then your last district, the one that's the most dense, is the one where they all become available, but that's because there's no density limit and it's the most open of the zoning districts. So again, nothing that's really super burdensome on these types, but we do suspect that it's probably pushing projects that could fit in, particularly projects that could fit in on a lot by lot basis. They might be more difficult to do, or some of the projects that are mixing are likely choosing to do things, would likely need to do things through a planned zoning district. And essentially what we're trying to do is to figure out which of these, for mixed density neighborhoods that have that mix of all of those small scale, but very human scale, I would even say, you know, we're talking 2 to 4 story buildings on a 5 to 10,000 square foot lot, and these patterns that can mix and match lots of different options. Again, not everywhere throughout your city, but where and how, without allowing the more suburban types, and also without allowing just the really large scale buildings that you might find in a transit oriented development or along your major corridors. Those are the things that we want to try to explore, especially since you have such a wide suite of zoning districts from the ranges of the R1s, R2s, and R3s. It seems like some better filtering of those types could occur if we explore a little bit further. And really what happens is when we look to how and why they fit in, there's typically a more fine-grained pattern that makes them all fit in. You know, it's certainly, we wouldn't be saying plop some of these down in the middle of a block in your R1 neighborhoods, but we can begin to study like where things on a corridor, or where a corner lot might be able to graduate up to the next scale of building, or how those buildings relate to one another, rather than thinking of it on a district-wide scale. Begin to think of it on a project or building type scale, and start to make some choices of what we want to see your development code promoting versus what we wouldn't want to see. So some observations. Again, I talked about we want to look at the transition. So I'll just go through the bullet points, and I apologize in advance for maybe reading some of these, but I just wanted to explain them. As I mentioned earlier, the R1 districts is fairly typical, and that's probably a good distinguishing based on lot sizes. The R1 C, I guess, is the most widely used of all of those zoning districts. So there may be some questions there, and there's probably some questions of right now they just enable the smaller lots, the ones that are mentioned in the L there with the table, simply based on if it was established already. So it's sort of a preserving the non-conforming. And then also something that was mentioned in the code assessment and from some of the public feedback is maybe we want to look at allowing accessory dwelling units more generously in some of these other districts as well. Again, another way to get housing diversity, but with really small scale development, and with development that really doesn't change the character and pattern of neighborhoods if it's done and cited appropriately. And so there was at least some direction to start looking at those standards as well. Then you move up to the shift between R1C and the R2A. So we now move up to the R2 categories, and essentially all of the development standards are exactly the same. So same lot patterns, building patterns, height, except that now that one building type can have 2 units instead of 1. So that's kind of a logical shift in our mind, but maybe a shift that we could look at doing in other districts as well. I don't know. Third bullet down, when we shift looking at within the R2, the differences, again, all of the same development standards. So essentially R1C, and R2A and R2B have just almost exactly the same lot and building patterns within them. Now that next building up can allow 3 units instead of 2 in the R2B. Although the building scale and building types didn't change, and that's where I mentioned before that might start to put some caps or limits on, you know, a 3 or a 4 unit building, but maybe appropriately so. The next shift up, the 4th bullet down, R2B to MUR3A, so mixed use residential 3A. Again, all of the same development standards. So you're not gaining more building capacity and development capacity. Now office use is added in as a potential use, signaling that mixed use. And this is where we're starting to sense some of the problems of we still haven't found that district that really promotes a row house or small apartment building. So that's the part that we think is missing in this code. And then the next shift up, MUR3A to MUR3B, it starts to allow the density go up so that row house and mixed use building or the small apartment building, I'm sorry, can become a little more viable in the MUR3A and MUR3B. But it's really, again, that last category that allows all of the multi-unit building types without a density limit. But again, it allows everything in. So there's some, particularly in the shift between R2B and MUR3A, and then the distinguishing within the MUR3 districts, we think maybe some more attention could be paid to the scale and types of buildings that would give us some better choices. I guess what I might do, well, I'll continue on. I'm going to transition now into some of the things that relate to development or neighborhood character, because certainly related to the building scale and housing options, and this will blend together. And I'll try to get through as quickly as possible and just turn it over to you guys for comments, observation, and discussion. But we start with the idea of, if you haven't noticed, we don't think density is the best evaluation of compatibility because it's just a number. So it doesn't tell us a lot about what are the essential things that make things fit in. It truly is just a number. Yet when we look at completely different numbers, there might be some things that really make the buildings relate well together or fit in. And we know that because we see all of these types in a lot of neighborhoods mixed together. The question might be, well, are we capping the scale of the building correctly? Is it a design element of the building? Is it simply a block structure issue where they fit in on one part of the block, but not other parts of the block? So a lot of those questions go into play of how we mix densities and get some of those, again, with the overall goal being supporting walkable commercial nodes and corridors, supporting transit, and having those transportation options. It's density for a purpose, right? Not for density just for the sake of density, and building more valuable and mixed density neighborhoods. That kind of plays into your city's goal of having more options for different stages of life so people can remain in the community. So all these options have a bigger and broader goal than just density for the sake of density. And so studying how they fit in is important. We tend to look at it in 2 different ways. The first is on the development side. So starting at housing types, that first part of the presentation, which housing types fit in and which ones don't. Once we settle on those, there's some issues of looking at the scale and massing of them to make sure they do fit in, because not all, just because you have the right building type doesn't mean it's guaranteed to fit in. And then the third part is, how does it relate to the neighborhood, the frontage design? We really promote the idea of the design of the frontages and how it relates to the streetscape can do a lot to determining how a project fits in, more so than any of the other elements necessarily. So paying attention to that relationship, and a common relationship between different building types can often make things appear very compatible. And then the second part of the flip side of that is what we call the public realm. There's certainly a lot of things that are not on the development side that will determine your neighborhood characters. Last time or 2 meetings ago, we talked about walkability and streetscape. So similar to the frontage types, an attractive streetscape can do a lot to take the focus off of the mix and range of buildings and sizes, and bring things into a more cohesive manner, just because it's a pleasant and attractive streetscape to be on. And then other landscape elements. And then the last part is civic spaces, things that aren't necessarily public, or maybe public, but the buildings are arranged around, whether that's courtyards or whether it's entry features and plazas and things like that, that at the larger scale buildings begin to tie things into the bigger picture. So those are the elements of character that we look at. Oh, I'm missing a slide here. Let me jump. I'm going to stop my screen share for a second and jump to my PowerPoint, because it really kind of sums up the discussion here. Apologize for this. Okay, so with that pause for contemplative thinking, this is a list of things we look at as the tools that can begin to mix those types together. You all have a lot of experience. If we were to check the boxes on these, there's probably 5 or 6 of them, probably even more, that you've already checked the box on in your current code. We may not have checked it with enough nuance and specificity, things like curb cut and driveway limits or garage limitations. Maybe they're different in some of the zoning districts than in others. The bulk plane, which the information Wade sent out, has been talked about extensively. That's looking at scale and massing from the lot boundaries. Do we need to look at scale and massing from the building types? In other words, how does the building itself, regardless of how it relates to the boundaries, how is the scale and massing of it broken up? So there's just a number of different ways to talk about these topics, and we want to find the right fit for you all. That's really, we're trying to strike a balance on 3 things. What reflects the character and essence of your neighborhoods that makes things fit in while meeting your planning goals for diversifying? What can be easily implemented? Some of these things are quite a large challenge to implement. And lastly, what are the things, where does the city stand in terms of regulating versus guiding versus enabling? That's some of the same things we talked about with sustainability. We'll need to be making choices on which of these are we just simply removing impediments and barriers to which are we going to say that no, that we got to regulate the bare minimum of all of these things. And so this is sort of a laundry list that we start with, and there's lots of kind of variations within here, but at that, I'll just kind of stop and pause and open it up to discussion on, are we on the right track of the things we want to explore? Have we missed things, or do you guys have any specific thoughts on some of these strategies that you appear on here, or even questions on what some of these strategies may be? I'd be happy to answer some of those as well. But with that, I'll turn it over to the committee to talk.
Brenda?
Hi, well, it's nice to see that tonight that we've outlined kind of an organized way of going about this. So this has been a great presentation. Thank you so far. And I think this is really getting to the heart of the matter for a lot of what the growth that we've been experiencing lately. I have it on my blog, and I do think that coming to some kind of way we can get them to do some architectural character in line with the surrounding houses would be, I think it's an important goal for the neighborhood. So I have a development in mind at Canyon and Galapago Streets, and I'm very pleased that they're taking down some old, really rental huts. You know, they tore down some stuff and the owner sold it, and it really wasn't beautiful in its architecture. But what they are doing is building something very modern across the street from something that was built in the 70s. And the 70s structures across the street are newer and they're really nice. They don't match the other side. So I don't know how a city can enforce some kind of architectural style, and I'd like to pursue that more.
Yeah, that's a great question. I have just a quick comment on that to distinguish between some of these categories. We usually encounter that in one of three ways. So the first two categories I would alert you to are going kind of, if I go from left to right, top to bottom, the quality and aesthetics category has some of those things that begin to add some depth, texture, and design to the building rather than just regulating the box. The second category, which you all have some experience with, the detailed scale and mass, begins to look at the box in a little more of a architecturally sensitive, but also architecturally neutral way. In other words, we still aren't into anything that's saying that particular architectural styles need to be done. It can be, and that's where you can kind of get into some trouble of requiring things to be broken up at a certain scale, or to have certain features on the building. Whereas if a building was doing something really representative of a particular architectural style, sometimes those generic standards can run counter to it. There's a way to balance that in the code, don't get me wrong, but it's just something that we need to be aware of. Then you go down to the next two categories, which are sort of the next level up, and these are the ones that can become difficult to implement. If you're truly shooting for certain architectural characteristics or similarities within a district that might have a prevalent style or theme to them, that's when you usually need to graduate up to something that does a detailed analysis of the styles themselves. What are the features and attributes to it? And often what we see is what's called a pattern book. In other words, it will document one or usually several different styles that are prevalent and document the essential elements of that. And then it becomes a matter of, okay, now how do we implement that? Does staff have the expertise, or really quite honestly, the time to implement that? Do we need a special review body to do that? So those begin to provoke bigger questions. And the same element sort of runs through the historic character and historic preservation. There's procedural and substantive issues there. And the big thing we watch out for here is we don't want, if it's truly, that's why I put that one is about historic preservation and documentation. In other words, we're not really trying to protect a neighborhood character through development. We're trying to say there's something really valuable here that we're losing. And then to do that, you would need to, one, you need the process, two, you need the analysis and documentation. And then three, either the local standards or Secretary of Interior standards will have things that say, okay, here's how you protect that historic asset. It doesn't mean necessarily that it's going to be a particular style. So that's the difference between those two. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do things exactly like the historic building was done. But it can be a frustrating one to deal with. Let me say that, because it is very, there's debates even within the historic preservation community of like, how is the best way to do that? So and I know those discussions have happened in your community already, and we just want to be sensitive to what's the ultimate goal here. If a lot of what we're really talking about is managing growth and change within the character of a neighborhood, we think we can accomplish that without necessarily doing a full-on historic designation. That doesn't mean you don't need it in certain places, but we just want to be very clear of when we have one goal, that might not be the overall goal for the neighborhoods. That might be a more strategic or targeted view of the historic properties. But we understand that you've had these conversations, and we understand that you probably have all of this going on in your community just by the nature of being an older and built out community.
Judy?
Way, and maybe, I mean, I brought this up previously in a different context, but what, what portions of this should be in our code and what portions of this really belong in the building code as opposed to the planning and zoning code, especially when it comes to land, architectural character or historic character. Is that not a better place to deal with that? Especially if we're going to go down to, just because I'm in an R1A district doesn't mean that I'm in the same, there's R1A up off a University near Arapahoe Acres, and then I'm in R1A down here by Bellevue Park. Those are the same zoning, but completely different neighborhoods. And I guess I'm having a hard time delineating where we should be talking about the zoning versus building code items, where we can control some of the more specific items within a development, I guess.
Yeah, that's a good question. We have some experience with what you just said on one of our cities where we're in our area where we're the on-call planner with, went through this discussion, and we actually look at it as kind of backing the things you're talking about, backing them out the other way. We like to think of the building code is usually, safety and those types of things, not so much design. Although, as we heard a little bit last week or last meeting 2 weeks ago, some of the building code issues do need to deal with different, redevelopment or rehab code versus a new building code. But usually those tend to be more mechanical, structural, life safety issues. So those wouldn't be where we would want to find a lot of things on this list, typically. So then the question becomes, okay, your initial point of maybe some of these don't belong in the zoning code. So there's two ways to address that. The distinction between, hey, two R1A neighborhoods aren't the same. You're either backing them out as guidelines or recommended practices, because we do want the code itself to be easily enforceable, easy interpreted, and shooting for the same objectives. But maybe different neighborhoods have different guidelines. Maybe they're recommended practices. Maybe they're an overlay district. You have some experience with that. The cautionary tale we have there, this is the one from the city where we're the on-call planner. They essentially, each neighborhood started to become its own zoning code. And that can become very difficult to implement. It can have a lot of problems of people's expectations because it's adding more complexity to your code, and we may want to be cautious about doing that. But the next step of that is, and maybe this is what you're getting at as well, sometimes the neighborhoods themselves might have these codes on their own. So that was what was going on in this community I was just explaining. The city finally realized that essentially what they were trying to do was to get the city to be on the hook to implement their own covenants and restrictions that the neighborhood had. And we kind of want to try to keep those things separate. So there's a lot of kind of shades of gray in your question. And I think that's what, we'll try to help filter that out. But we look at actually backing them out the other way. If we think of the building code as the bare essence of public health and safety, the zoning code starting to look at development patterns, character, and to some degree how everything fits in, and how far we push that on the design side is something we'll explore. And then on the full-on design side, it's usually either recommended practice outside of the code, or it's some type of covenant or private association that neighborhoods often have of their own way they build and distinguish the character.
Christine?
Yeah, I was looking through some of the houses on the tour that Wade sent out and trying to notice which ones looked like they fit in and matched the neighborhood character and which didn't, even though a lot of them were bigger and newer. Some seemed to fit in better than others. And I was also looking at some in my neighborhood, and honestly, the architectural element that seemed to tie it together better in these old bungalow neighborhoods was the roof shape. Whether it has a triangle roof, it seemed to blend in more. And if it was one of the new kind of blocky square ones, those seemed to feel kind of out of place.
Brenda?
Yeah, along those lines, I was just Google searching Denver. I know that Denver had passed some regulations limiting architectural character at some scope. And it seems that what they did was the ban what's called lot homes. So you can Google search that, and it's just that kind of style where it looks really, really modern, but what it's really designed to do is to be a big giant box where they put some windows. So I know that the argument is that architectural style will cost a lot of city resources and could get into some messy territory, but I think nonetheless, as a community, we want to explore some things we can do. So maybe we can look at what other cities are doing to keep from, I guess it's called slot homes. And that's not, I don't know if there's any this bad in the tour, but you'll get the idea.
Kate Townley? Oh, I'm sorry.
Thanks. Yeah, and I think we did some work on coming up with some recommendations for slot homes and things like that. And maybe that was gonna get rolled into this general update. I guess one of the things that I have a hard time with is that I appreciate really good architectural design, but it's still subjective. It's like what I appreciate may be different than what other people appreciate. And we have quite a few different types of styles of houses and quite a few that are, you know, from World War II, small square foot housing that I live in, you know, and so I think it's hard to pick out those pieces and that we could say, oh, everyone should follow this standard or follow this guideline, because I don't know if that's going to really benefit us as a community. And I guess one of the things I look back at too is like the purpose of having a land use code is for, you know, health, safety, and welfare. And so how do we tie architectural standards back to those needs? Is it for safety? Is it for our general welfare, or how can we defend that? So I guess that's something that I think of, because it's typically health, safety, welfare, and not doing undue burden onto a property owner. And so I think we need to balance or consider those needs, and how do you get everybody's styles to agree on what you would want in something that is a code, which is law. So just those are my thoughts.
Bernie?
Yeah, just to briefly tailgate on what Kate said, I think there are some instances where I think it's appropriate to try and establish some sort of architectural pattern. I think that overall, though, it's a slippery slope. Good architecture is more about scale and massing than it is about a style, and it's very subjective. I think somebody brought up an infill development, which I think I'm responsible for designing earlier. And it's really interesting what people see as far as context, because you can see the 1970s, you know, homes, sort of suburban homes, that they were out of context when they were built in the 1970s. And if you go 2 blocks to the north, there's industrial buildings, and around the corner are apartments. And so I think architecture does change over time, and we should be allowing people to build based on the time and the current, needs and demands really of the market. Having said that, one of the things that I've been working on in other communities and I do think would actually help preserve architectural character in the neighborhood is to have some trade-offs where if you are building a one-story home, whether it's an addition, a remodel, or a new build, to allow for some greater lot coverage and maybe some flexibility in setbacks if you are to build a single-story home. In other words, if you're going to go in and let's say it's an infill development in a community where it's traditionally, either post-war or pre-war single-story homes, allow for the necessary components of a market-based single-story home to be built by allowing some greater lot coverage. And I think maybe if it's a one-story element, some greater, some leeway in setbacks, especially the front setback. The other thing, as we go into this, and this is mostly for single family and or lower density residential that I'm talking about, is to also allow for an attached garage to meet the same requirements as a detached garage. A lot of times when I'm dealing with even remodels to these older homes, we can't get what people want to fit on the lot due to some restrictions in lot coverage and setbacks. So I think we can preserve the nature of a lot of these single-story communities by allowing some development options which broaden the palette and promote single-story and or story and a half development in some of these areas where we're seeing fairly typical 2.5 story boxes, because that's what the zoning code is kind of promoting.
Colin?
I guess I will piggyback on Kate and Bernie there. Also, I came from an area that had a historic district that didn't allow us to do anything, and it was frustrating as all get out. And the reality is my 1923 house was a Sears Craftsman bungalow that got shipped in a crate and wasn't historic in any sort of shape, but was deemed historic. And so I like the idea of trying to go more towards the character side. And I know there was comments about maybe does that limit too many things, but I do think that there are homes out there that can be larger. I think 2-story homes or even some of the larger ones can fit as long as they fit architecturally and contextually. And so I would lean towards not historic, but some sort of characters. And realistically, we are fully built out. We don't have infill coming in, or I'm sorry, greenfield projects that are going to be happening. We have redevelopment. So if we have 6 areas or something like that, or maybe 8, not a ton. If we have something like that, I think it's something that we can develop characters for each one of those areas. And I think that would be the way I would lean towards going, as opposed to really just a straight up historic that has to follow the Department of Interior requirements, because those stink. But really go more towards some sort of character development. So I appreciate the thoughts on that.
Sorry, Andy?
Yeah, I'll piggyback as well. I'm just concerned to do anything that makes doing new projects, adding more housing, or people being able to add on to their house, that just makes things less feasible. I think we can still do a lot with massing and scale without getting into specifying materials. And I think having some flexibility so that people can use some more of their lot without going up is really an interesting idea, just because I know we've run into it on the Board of Adjustment and Appeals, where someone is going to move to attach their garage just by sake of expanding, and suddenly they're well over the setback that would be for an attached garage. And so there's just some weird disincentives that I know we've seen. And Also, I'm a little concerned with the accessory dwelling units, that we're more restrictive on those than we are on garages or other types of accessory structures. And I think we should try and even that out a little bit, because I think people are going to start converting some of those to accessory dwelling units, or at least trying, and we need to just maybe add some of that flexibility in as well.
Oh, sorry, Brenda.
Oh, I will piggyback off that and say, full disclosure, I am doing an accessory dwelling unit right now. And that rear 35% thing did catch me off guard, and I had to get a variance. It is crazy. So, but you know, full disclosure, I'm in the process right now. I hope it helps what we're going through. That's all I wanted to say. So ask me any questions as I go through this whole ordeal. Thanks.
Okay, Judy?
I just wanted to agree with the setback thing. We have talked on and on. We have a relatively small, we are on a big lot, a 9,000 square foot. Ours is almost 10 square foot lot. We have a single story home with a detached garage. When I start looking at setbacks and stuff, I can't make my house any bigger. If somebody, a young couple, this is fine for us. It's just the two of us. But if a young couple wanted to stay in Englewood and do something to increase their house, their only option is to go up. And there's not a 2-story house in our entire neighborhood. And I mean, there are some further away, but certainly nowhere, and probably in the 4 blocks in any direction is there really a 2-story house. So, and I know that there's a lot of people that have issues with, if we would put a 2-story house here, we'd probably hear about it. But we wouldn't, if we wanted to make it bigger, we don't want to go up. The reason we bought a ranch is because we didn't want to have stairs. So the setback is definitely an issue. And just as an aside, when we went through the torturous ADU discussion, I have always said, why on earth we don't allow them in R1A with the biggest lots was always beyond my comprehension. And 2, when we looked at the requirements for the ADU, even though we have a huge lot, I couldn't figure out how we could do it unless we stuck it on top of our garage. And then, yes, I agree. The ADU stuff is way too restrictive. And if we really, and we're going to need to, I think we certainly have to review setback requirements, especially on the larger lots, because, we just have all this yard that we don't really need, and most especially in the front. But so that's just my opinion on that. But ADUs, I think, should be allowed in all residential zones. And R1A especially, and I think that you ought to be able to make them bigger than what they are currently at. But we beat that till it felt like it was a dead horse when the first time around. But maybe we have a little more people that are a little more open to it now.
Kate Townley?
Yeah, I would agree. And just seeing a couple slides ago, the recommendations or maybe an idea for how to add on to each of the different zone districts. I would like to see ADUs added on as an option for the R1A as well. And yeah, I think we're at a point where we got it through the first hurdle and the sky hasn't fallen. So it's time to be able to add them to some other places. And I do like the idea of having more of the flexibility in order to essentially sort of incentivize more 1-story dwellings, and or allow people to be able to expand in different ways. I think what can get difficult is that I think all of our zone districts allow for 2 stories at least. And so we can't, I would have a hard time taking that right away from anyone. I mean, that's their ability to be able to build 2 stories. But I do like that idea of being able to have more of that flexibility so people can keep a 1 story. And that definitely ties in more to those, you know, ability to have a house that you can live in for many years and to have those 1 story homes that many of our communities are lacking. And I believe Centennial's actually doing a pattern book right now and looking at how can they have more houses that people can live in well, you know, into their older years, and when they have only 1 story and it's easier living and that sort of thing. So I think having those more of those options would, and that flexibility would be great.
Colin?
And I love the option of being able to look at setbacks too. The only thing I want to make sure we're also considering is lot coverage when we have, you know, these huger or larger single story that obviously covers a lot more of the lot. It reduces green space that's on there. It reduces infiltration. There's more runoff. You know, if we're going all the way to the lot lines, we could create some other issues that I think we want to make sure that we're considering also. I'm not saying that I'm against it by any stretch. I just want to make sure that we consider some of those other issues that might be the case too.
Andy?
Yeah, I think the point about lot coverage and keeping an eye on that makes sense, but I guess I'm confused. Is there any good reason to keep around these number of square feet of lot per unit if we also have lot coverage? Does that continue to make sense, or should we just focus on lot coverage and not tie that density limit by having a lot size per unit?
Bernie?
Yeah, the lot coverage thing is interesting, and it usually comes up. It's sort of an abstract number, and if we're looking at issues of stormwater and runoff, I think we need to look at it holistically. One of the things that has changed dramatically, I think, since the current code was certainly put in, is that the outdoor space that people are desiring, whether it's covered patios or decks or all of the items that count towards lot coverage, they're not necessarily always equal to habitable space, and you run into a lot of problems with that, with trying to get those to work. And actually they can sometimes help with drainage issues and runoff issues and things of that nature, but we're looking at this abstract little strip of space, and I would like for us to try to look at it a little bit more holistically, especially with some of the recent changes towards trying to improve our alleyways, and quite frankly, we need to improve our stormwater system. So putting that burden on single family homes and these sort of abstract notions of lot coverage, I think we really need to look at some models and some examples, because what you're trading off for in these 1 and 1.5 story homes is that you're still allowing the character of the neighborhood to exist. You're also allowing for that neighboring home to maintain its privacy and its solar access and all of the things that we constantly hear. So I don't think it's not either you can only build a 2-story, you can only build a 1-story. What I'm proposing is allow people to build a larger 1-story if they so choose. And I think the concern for some of the lot coverage items, as far as green space and things of that nature, can be overcome, and I think that would be part of the trade-off there. Anyway, this happens quite often in almost every new community that goes in, mostly suburban communities, but you see it in a lot of these sort of new communities, even with alley homes and things of that nature, where there is a greater lot coverage allowance for homes that are, the majority of the design is single story. And I just think it's going to solve, I think it's going to help preserve our neighborhoods more than people think. I think we run into a lot of restrictions. We've heard some of them here just on this board for people that live in single family homes now. I don't think it needs to be a big increase, but I just think it needs to allow people to be able to do to their homes what they, what they need to do in order to keep pace with the amenities that are allowed in a 2 or 3 story home.
Brenda?
Well, yeah, what came to mind when you were discussing that is solar access. I have solar panels on my ranch style home, and all along my side of the block has been ranch style homes until they built the 3-story townhomes kind of in the middle here on Fox Street by the police station. Now, I'm lucky so far. I still have access with my solar, but I will tell you that at least one of my neighbors, probably who's been a homeowner for 30 years, probably won't be a homeowner all of their life. And they could sell the lot, and then they'll put up 3 stories next to me, and there goes my energy. So I think you're right that some of the coverage could be maybe accommodated for some situations, but there again, I'm just going to make a plea for, I don't think it can be across the board, and I think it needs to be by neighborhood, and I think it does need to be on a case-by-case basis. And I would say that if it's the will of the people to put more energy and resources towards this kind of thing, then I think that our organization needs to make that case. I'm done. Lowering hand.
Anyone else?
I have a handful
Christine?
of questions, if that's okay, since I'm still learning about some of this. Is there, for the areas that allow multifamily, is there a minimum square footage for each dwelling unit, indoor square footage? Can you make tiny little studios, or are those not allowed?
I'll defer to Brooke or Wade, but I did not see it in your code, so I don't think there is a minimum on the multi-unit buildings.
Right.
It's more of a maximum per lot area.
That's correct. Yep.
Okay.
So that unit, so the small unit counts just as much as a large unit, and so you would use up your unit count for your lot area quicker than you would, other than that MU
Oh.
R3 C district that doesn't have a unit cap.
Oh, I see. Okay. That's interesting. So that would be what would cap having, smaller studios or something.
Right.
Okay, interesting. Well, I think that's something we should look at then, allowing some in multifamily areas where we can have smaller units and more of them as a more affordable option.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, there is no, from a zoning code perspective, there is no minimum square footage size per unit. There are some building code requirements for sort of minimum size of a room, but it's pretty small. So
Okay.
yes.
Okay, next question for those of you like Chris that look at a lot of different cities' zoning codes. Do we have the right number of zone districts? Is this kind of average? I mean, there's a lot of different kinds of zones in there.
Right. That's a great question. I'm a bit of a kind of an organization freak on the code, and I kind of want things to work technically from the big picture. And that's not always the right answer for a community that's just trying to get what works for them. But I would say this is, when I first saw your code, I thought, oh, there's too many and there's not good distinctions between them. Now that I understand it a little bit more, I think you're about at the right number. I would hesitate adding more. I would think we would need to look at, are we making the right distinctions between them? And when we do that, we need to think of the map, of course, because some areas are already zoned this, and what would a change to one of these categories do to areas already mapped that. But that's what we kind of plan on looking at first. It doesn't mean we wouldn't end up at, hey, to get all these types to relate well together, we need to add a new district. That's entirely possible, but we kind of keep that as a last resort because we do try to keep the code simpler. And then a lot of times what we want to do is to make sure that a district can have several of these things going on. And that's the other thing we're going to be looking at is how easily can do these lot sizes and dimension standards relate, or the unit counts within a building relate to the next one up. In other words, can you easily change from one to the next, or take a lot and convert it into 2 or 3, and if so, where? And so that kind of incremental and long-term evolution within a zoning district is what we would be looking at as well. And again, not every zoning district, but you probably do want to have 1 or 2 that allow that to happen as well.
Okay, so it sounds like you're saying we probably shouldn't add districts unless it comes to that.
Right.
Do you see any that you thought might be consolidated?
Yeah, again, at first I did, but now I'm starting to question that, and this discussion has me questioning even more. But the R1C, R2A, and R2B, all very similar. So for example, if you're only graduating from R1C to R2A to get a duplex, maybe we want a question of, hey, what's wrong with having a 2-unit house in R1C when it looks and is shaped exactly the same as a 1-unit house? It just happens to have 2 units in it. So those types of questions we might want to look at and see if and maybe that would be 2, since R1C is a lot of your city. We'd want to certainly be very cautious about that. But there's things like that that would maybe cause us to merge districts. But I'm seeing that less and less the more I learn about your code. But initially I thought yes.
Okay, that's super helpful. Yeah, it does seem like a lot of the outcry, just an opinion about the duplexes, were that they were so huge compared to the little tiny single bungalows next door to them. That seemed to be more of a concern than the fact that they were a duplex.
Yeah, and I think most of our discussion tonight is noting that, that can happen with a single unit just as much as it can happen with a duplex too. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll want to look at that.
Okay, one other question for you and the whole group. I was interested how you were saying it's kind of hard to fit in row homes, and I guess you'd call them like quadplexes, even though that's some of the missing middle that we really want to accomplish. How do we do that? Do you have any opinions on how we can start fitting those in and to other people?
Yeah, you're tricking me into giving the answers before next year, but yes. I'll give you the reason why we brought that up. We typically see a row house building type in the anywhere from 14 at the small end to 18 to 20 at the large end in terms of width, and sometimes those can be individually owned. And then, so that means under your lot size here in most of the districts where it's 3,000 per unit, that dimensions meaning it needs to be at least 120 or more deep. And that's really deep for a row home. So we typically find those row home units fitting anywhere from 1,500 square feet to 2,000 or a little more per unit on a lot. Now that doesn't mean there will be a difference on if it's platted for individual ownership versus it's a group of buildings where sometimes they can make up that lot area in common space. Those things can all happen. That's why I said it's not impossible to do row house units. You're just trying to do a math equation to get to the number, whereas we might want to study some examples, study some patterns, and say, let's just codify that and figure out which district it fits in. And then I think a similar exercise could be done with the small apartment building, that kind of 4 to 6 or 8 unit building that can sometimes fit on the smaller lots. That's the one that's probably experiencing some pressure on this. And so we'll just like to learn more of where people think those fit in and why.
That sounds good. Thanks.
Bernie?
I think a lot of the row house typology, or a lot of that missing middle, is usually found in transitional zoning areas. And that's one of the challenges we have. If you look at a large portion of Englewood right now, we go directly from Main Street to, single unit or lower density multifamily in a lot of places right away. Now, some of those areas allow for the duplex or the triplex. And so you're starting to see that happen, especially on either side of Broadway, on Acoma and Lincoln, et cetera. So that's really always, I think, been the challenge, is how do you balance some of the existing neighborhoods with allowing some of those areas to have some more options, so that we can have that transitional zoning and increase the diversity in our housing type. It's starting to naturally happen. Some people don't like that. It's just where the zoning opportunities are. And the vast majority of our residential lots are zoned for a single unit. So what we're seeing as far as low density multifamily is happening in those areas where it's allowed right now. So I mean, it's more of a statement, I guess, than a question, but it would be interesting to see how we're not only looking at historic context of what was there in 1950 or 1970, but what do we see happening? What has happened in the last 10 years that has changed that context of what that neighborhood is now? And should that really be dictating where some of these new options are allowed?
Yeah, that's a good point. I'll just add on to that's part of the looking at the distinctions between the districts, because the trick or the strategy to do that effectively is, can we find, if we determine that some of these types are inadvertently being forced out, which zoning district do we build them into? And then we would look at, okay, where and how do they fit in on a block? Like, so maybe it's row houses really only fit in if you take an end grain of a block and combine a couple lots and then build them. And then we can start to have some criteria or rules for, where could it happen in areas that may already be zoned that, or B, oftentimes it's going, and this is probably the better case scenario, it's going to require a rezoning to that district, to where then you have the discretion to evaluate, are those conditions and criteria that make it fit in well that we established in the code, are those being met? Those are the two things that we're going to try to look at if we start adding new types in, because your point is exactly right, that a large part of your neighborhood scape of blocks and lots is geared for exactly what those R1 patterns are saying. So yeah.
Andy?
I'm curious, I had a question as well, whether parking factored at all into the density calculations that you did?
It not in ours yet. It is a big factor. In fact, I was going to offer up when I think maybe it was even you that brought up the, hey, do we need to eliminate the per unit lot size? We often find that the parking, either the requirement itself or the demand for it that the person developing will put on, will be the limiting factor for some of these types. In other words, if you have to find 5 to 10 parking spaces on your lot to build one of these types, it's going to be a challenge, whether that's required or whether you're doing that to meet your market dynamics. And so then from our standpoint, from the looking out for the public interest and the protecting the neighborhood, it becomes a design challenge of, we're trying to mitigate where and how the parking goes, more so than we're trying to say you need to meet a minimum standard oftentimes.
Okay, thanks.
Christine?
I thought of another question, if that's okay, about transit-oriented development. Are there any zoning changes that we would need to encourage more transit-oriented development, or are all our transit areas already in kind of the free-for-all zoning category?
I'll give you my quick outsider's objective, and then Wade and Brooke can dive in with the details that I'm going to miss probably. But the first thing I would say is almost all of the districts you have on here right now can be very transit supportive. I mean, when we're looking at these, you're looking at densities in the, 7 to, and particularly if we add in some of the missing middle categories, overall 7 to 20 units per acre on a neighborhood scale. That's very transit supportive. So a mix of these districts is going to really kind of thicken up your units and neighborhoods to the ones where the transit agencies are like, that's hitting our target. So then I think your more specific question about transit oriented, we would consider those sort of the station area, larger scale developments and projects, which what I neglected to have on this table. So that would put us probably in the MU R3C, maybe the B category, depending on what we would do with it here. But then we quickly jump over to your mixed use districts. Your commercial districts also allow residential buildings in them without some of these density constraints. So those where we would probably see the really, transit adjacent larger scale projects being handled through that. And those would be ones where going back to our very first conversation, having different parking strategies for those building types and those locations is probably warranted.
And ironically enough, most of the land surrounding the transit stations is zoned industrial, which does not permit residential units. So most of the projects you see along there are planned unit developments. So it's a negotiated zoning district, if you will, and to allow residential. And so then the city has negotiating power to talk about parking ratios and parking spaces and other amenities that would be allowed to permit the higher density in those areas. So it's a trade-off, if you will. So that's the ironic part of our transit-oriented areas primarily. There's some exceptions to that, but we often look at PUDs for those cases.
Andy?
The only other observation I'd make about transit-oriented development is that we had a case at the Board of Adjustment and Appeals where it was all about the requirement for ground floor commercial and the fact that that just wouldn't work to program the site, whether it's parking or just not being able to lease out that space. So that in the MUC districts, that seems to be a limiting factor, that requirement for commercial on the first floor.
Bernie?
Yeah, Andy jumped on what I was going to say. I mean, the comment was made earlier that we're a built out city and this is going to be mostly, infill. I do think that there's a difference in scale, and I do see some opportunities, especially in our changing environment with some areas regarding retail and even office space. So I do think looking at giving flexibility within the zoning code for those areas that are now zoned industrial. The other thing is along Broadway, I think there's ways, or any of the Main Street areas, including what could potentially happen around the Civic Center, is I think there's ways of activating that street level with activities that aren't necessarily mixed use in nature. I think there's some areas where mixed use works, and I think we'll see a bounce back in the demand for those storefront areas that we're not necessarily seeing right now. But I do see some challenges, especially with residential developers who don't want to get into the mixed use game. There's a couple of, I think, really well done 3-story developments that have been built in the last few years along Broadway in Denver. And I would say about 80%, if not higher, of the retail ground floor area is still unleased or unpurchased, and depending on the case. So I think having some flexibility in that could help with some of those transition areas, and quite honestly helping to reestablish Broadway as both from a walkability standpoint and a vitality standpoint.
Christine?
I was curious more about the industrial areas, light industrial areas. So I was glad you guys were bringing it up. Would it be desirable to add some more flexibility into the industrial areas even allowing multifamily, or is it preferable to do it each on a PUD one by one basis?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Good question. I think it's something we could look at. I know there's been pushback about PUDs in the past, especially from council. But on the other hand, there's also some concern, again, from council in the past, that that industrial area really is a vital part of the city's job network and manufacturing, and that land has some value as well. And they've cautioned against really eroding that industrial zoning too much in the past. So there's pros and cons on both sides, I guess. But it is interesting to maybe try to get away from as many of these negotiated zonings as we can, especially if you're tied to the TOD, the transit stations, and so forth. But keeping in mind that there's value in that industrial land as well. So I think it's a really good, interesting question to look at further in terms of what we could do there.
That's a good point. That makes sense. So the jobs question, it probably depends, the density of the jobs there. If it's a warehouse that's mostly storage with a couple people, it's not as many jobs. But if it's a bigger, then that's really useful. I was wondering about the industrial, because it seems like there's an outcry about putting too much multifamily in the small bungalow areas. People are pretty protective of that.
Right.
But I don't think anyone would care very much if there were more multifamilies in kind of where the warehouses are, because it wouldn't affect those homeowners
Right.
personally.
Right. And, I also wanted to throw in this as well that would probably make Andy and Bernie happy, is that we did recently remove that ground floor commercial requirement from the MUB1 everywhere except in the 33, 34, and 3500 blocks of Broadway. So no more variances to that, Andy.
Okay, Judy?
Bit of a side note, but it's important, especially when we're talking about so much multifamily building, is that, we currently have about over 50%. The latest number that I have access to is 52% of our housing units are non-owner occupied. And that is a huge percentage. And it puts an extraordinary burden on our schools, because when you have non-owner occupied, they aren't settled here. So I don't know what the current number is, but when I went to a meeting with the school superintendent when they hired a new one, this was quite a few years ago now, but in any single classroom, they would have a 30% turnover in students. And if you can imagine, that wasn't all at once. Every couple of weeks, you have a new student coming in and one leaving. The burden that it puts on our school system is extraordinary. Now, I know that we can't necessarily deal with that from a zoning standpoint, but I do want to caution us that when we have multifamily, it is almost inherently going to be rental as opposed to owner occupied. And when we increase that, there's other effects on our community that I think we need to make sure that we don't forget what that does to our community, because we're small in relationship. The fact that we have a huge number of our single family homes that are non-owner occupied is a discussion that, is a whole different discussion that, I've always said we should have a higher tax burden on those owners, but anyways, higher property tax burden, but it's just something that I want us to pay very close attention to, that somehow, I don't know how you use zoning to encourage owner occupancy, but you know, if it means we have, you know, duplexes that are for, you know, owner occupied kind of things everywhere, I'd be more for that, knowing that it was going to be families that were going to purchase and stay here than a whole bunch of multifamily rental properties. So I know it's not exactly a zoning code thing, but we have a serious non-owner occupied problem in Englewood, and we have had that for years.
Christine?
Yeah, those are good points. I wanted to ask the question that Judy asked in there. Are there zoning techniques that any other cities have tried out to push the development towards more owner occupied, even if it's multifamily, even if it's row houses or so forth, or
Yeah,
condos?
typically not, because as Judy mentioned, the code doesn't really distinguish, nor probably could it or should it, between how someone owns property or not. But what could affect it is we're usually on a path to make some of these types easier to build and market anyway. And that often means looking at standards, just like Judy mentioned, of, hey, can you own half a duplex? How easy, how hard is it? You know, with the party wall agreements or the lot standards, can you split it and own half? And now there's other issues to look at that. But when I mentioned the townhome one, that's one where, you know, everyone's often wanting to own that individually, and how easy can you do that? So the code can look at eliminating some of those barriers, and as long as, you know, the property maintenance and building maintenance things are addressed, the path to owning those could be easier for maybe for other reasons, but the impact on schools or other dynamics of having more ownership or a happy side benefit from that, I think. That's usually as far as I'm used to seeing it go, but we can look into other options as well.
There have been some, I wouldn't say city of Inglewood or local control type issues, but that have been somewhat of late a barrier to ownership as opposed to being a tenant. And one of them is just in the state of Colorado, some construction defects laws having to do with condominiums. So where you used to have a trend of apartment buildings converting to condominium buildings and home ownership, that the trend has been away from condominiums. Now, certainly duplexes, triplexes, and in some cases townhomes, certainly in Inglewood, those can be individual lots and don't fall under the construction defects laws. So there is law out there that can have an effect on ownership patterns. I wanted to ask, we're getting kind of late here, but Kate or Suzanne or Meg or Noel, do you guys have anything to chime in on? No? Yeah,
No. Noel, we can't hear you.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. I particularly liked the parts about what I would essentially call bribing people to build one-story buildings. I think that anytime we can put in incentives, it's great. That way we're not telling people what to do, but we are incentivizing them. We all have an example that touches us. I think my next door neighbor is having a child, and it's too expensive to go up, and setbacks are giving them a hard time about going in any other direction. So they're likely moving to Denver, keeping the house and renting it out. And for the comment about the schools, that's one more unit turned into a rental. I'd also love to see ADUs simpler. Seems like it was written to discourage people from building them, almost as a, we swear we like this idea, and a bit of a disincentive. I looked at adding one in our backyard and pretty quickly decided it was almost easier to buy another property than it was to build an ADU. But no, I like the observations about whether it makes sense to squish zoning units together. I had initially thought there were too many, but I, especially after the additional digging in from today, can appreciate what is there. And mixed use, definitely. I know the ground floor retail is just not, it doesn't fly, or at least that's what I've heard in planning and zoning for the last almost 2 years, every time it's come up. But any type of mixed use, I think, is great. I spent many years in Boston, or Cambridge specifically, and really enjoyed that. It was very dense up against the big streets, and very quickly fell down to single family or 1 to 2 story duplexes a little further away. Meant that, well, kind of a side note, I found a corner store. I'm not sure if any of you have found them in Englewood, but I found one. They're hard to find. I think they should be in more places. Turns out it's not a corner store anymore. Well, I'm not sure, but so if anyone wants to open a corner store, I have a property for you. But yes, zoning that would allow more of, this is along Floyd, so more of those things along places like Floyd. So yeah, thanks everyone. This has been a particularly good meeting in terms of the info that has come forward.
Bernie? Bernie, we can't hear you either.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, there we go.
Okay, hooray for corner stores. I think Brooke touched on something that was running through my mind, and I think we need to start looking at some of the allowances as less of a density number of units and more of a volume, massing, scale, and size of building, because we can allow, whether it's owner occupied or owner owned scenarios similar to an ADU that are much easier and to build, that could later be converted to owner occupied. So I think attacking that missing middle with things that are sensitive to the character of the neighborhood, but looking at it how maybe there are some things that are going to come down the road that are going to allow us to build some smaller for sale units that I think we all want in the city, and that there's a huge demand for. So I think looking at it more and allowing maybe more unit counts, but without with some caveats on that and with some control on it from a building standpoint. There's been some good, interesting studies where you take the basic shell of a standard 2-story home, Denver Foursquare or otherwise, and it looks exactly the same from the outside, whether it's 1 family in there or 4. And so I think looking at it and trying to promote on the smaller scale, or at least allowing people to have creativity in allowing on the smaller scale some owner occupied density, I think would be worthwhile investigating.
Kate Fuller?
I just have like a list of notes and reactions, so I was just going to share those with the group. In general, I feel like sometimes if you write too many rules, there are going to be people that are going to go out of their way to push the limits. So that's just kind of something that we should be careful about. And then another thing, Judy, when you were talking about schools, and like having more ownership of homes. It reminded me about recently there's been a lot of forecasting that in the future, a lot of people like millennials, if you don't already own a home, it's going to be really difficult to get one. And then the generation right behind millennials, we might have forever renters be just like the family situation. And I know even with like high-end housing, there are a lot of people that they're just going to rent forever and not own. So I guess I'm not sure how much we can control that with all of this, but I think it's going to be more about people are going to be willing to pay rent in areas where the schools are best. And so how can we attract people to our schools? So I think that's just going to be a challenge for every community moving forward. And then so people are either going to have to rent in a place or they're going to have to move super far out to a suburb to be able to afford more space. And then another thing I wrote was, I totally at first I came into this meeting like kind of being like, we need better setbacks because all the houses are so close. But after hearing everybody's perspectives, I totally see both sides. So I do like the idea of a sort of compromise. If you go low, you can go far. If you go high, you can't go as far. I think that sounds like a really good idea. And then to speak to character of Inglewood, I really like how all of the houses are different. I can't remember who, but someone mentioned that at the time where a lot of our buildings were built, they were a little bit new age, not like out of place at the time, but over time, they kind of grew into the neighborhood. So I'd want to consider that. And so maybe there's a way, going back to how we could encourage good behavior, like identify a few common threads in our guidelines that are just, this is what Inglewood character is, we encourage you. And I'm not sure if we can incentivize people to kind of pull some inspiration from our common threads. And then the last comment I had was that I live near Miller Field and all the buildings are very different over here. I think it works well in our neighborhood because we're really close to Hampden and the busy streets. So it feels more like a city over here. But just streets away, there are these cozy neighborhoods tucked away. So it is really important to remember that, you know, every single neighborhood, even though we're all super close to each other, has very unique characters. So just wanted to add that.
Bernie? Bernie, you're on mute. Okay, Kate Townley.
I'll just share one other little tidbit. So many of our streets, you know, have the Hollywood curb and the small sidewalk. And for me, when I'm walking down a street worried about whether or not I'm going to fall into the street, I'm not looking at the houses. So I think by thinking about some of that infrastructure and walkability and having those pieces in place are really important for the character, regardless of which part of the city you're in.
Okay, Bernie, your hand is still up. Did you wish to make some more comments or ask questions? Okay, Bernie's hand is down.
Oh, sorry.
I have a quick question. In our code today, and in a lot of codes that are of an older vintage, there's a lot of talk about low density, medium density, high density zone districts. I'm just curious, is that becoming more of an antique kind of phrase? Or how would they fit in with, you know, your first slide or whatever that you showed with the curve on it, and classifying those different types of housing types? How particularly would they fit in with low, medium, and high density? And is that something we really should care about anymore?
Yeah, I take it that question's for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we look at it in two ways. I tend to think density is a good evaluator on a neighborhood scale or a planning scale when you're talking about infrastructure or how you impact transportation or how you impact the commercial market for a walkable center. Those numbers all mean something. when you get to a project level, I think some of the comments tonight are reinforcing that the building is going to determine the relationships and what fits in and what doesn't, regardless of how many units are in it. So that's where that graph we have shows that you get to really weird numbers, and all of a sudden the small scale, the gentle density projects don't work because everyone's assumption is density means bigger buildings, and it doesn't. So I think finding that balance would be important. I wouldn't say that it's totally irrelevant, but when we look at it from a project and site scale, we think it is. Maybe on a zoning district scale, we're using it for some type of benchmark to make decisions, but it all depends on, do you have the right tools in the absence of density? So.
Okay, yeah, all right, thanks.
Brenda?
Yeah, thanks for letting me tag on to that, because I think it does make a big difference, a big impact. For instance, and I am zoned MU, multi-unit. So by de facto, my block and the ones around me are multi-unit. So it's understood that I have a different density than somebody in just a plain R district. So I'm building this ADU, and should I have the same restrictions to build this ADU that somebody in an R district has, or rather, that's where I thought we would make a distinction, is where we want the density and where do we already have multi-units. So I have on this block a senior facility at the end, a home assisted care facility, because it's multi-unit. So when I'm building this ADU, it's really just converting my garage into a rental, because I'm 900 square feet anyway, so it's just really like an extra bedroom. But it's already multi-unit is my point. I'm not changing the character of the neighborhood. Certainly we can go through these zones and look at the existing neighborhood, and then through an evaluation that probably hasn't happened in 50 years, to say, oh, is this really an industrial neighborhood? Well, sure, we can change that. Or this is an MU. This is multi-unit. Yeah, they don't need to have the same ADU restrictions or building restrictions as somebody, say, in Arapahoe Acres. You know, so I would like to see that we do this on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis. And there, I mentioned this before, is because of that would answer our character, how we answer the character of the neighborhood. There's no character in my neighborhood at all. So it's pretty okay that they're scraping it and building better stuff. I'm really happy about that. But I know that there are districts that don't want that same kind of density, and that's how we can address what the actual neighbors or homeowners want.
Yeah, and I think that's the one thing that made me start to realize that the system you have, the districts you have, can be good distinguishers. That R1, we can figure out a way to do multiple units in R1 through ADU, and R2 through multi-unit buildings, in the MUR3 through larger scale multi-unit buildings. And so that's where I think that we're starting to build our list of things that we have a technical committee that we have to report to. Our list of questions is based on this is getting longer, because the bigger one that density affects is some of the infrastructure issues, taps, meters, things like that we'll have to be aware of. Do you have capacity, you know, for the same building having 1 unit, now having 4? Is there any issues we need to be aware of? And then I think what was discussed earlier, the bigger impact would be, is it a parking and traffic impact? So if we can use the R1, R2, and our MUR3 as those filters, we might be able to blend those districts a little better, but also make really meaningful distinctions.
Okay, does anybody have any final questions or any questions about the process moving forward or anything like that? Just remind you that December 7th is our next meeting. However, it will be a short meeting because the Planning Commission will have a agenda and a public hearing that night. So we will meet from 6 to 7. And then that will be the last meeting of the year for us. So, Kate, tell me.
There was just one thing, Chris, I think you had a slide where you had different typologies of missing middle and things like that, and we're that there would be an opportunity to talk to community members and ask, does it fit or doesn't it? And I guess if that's happening, if it could, instead of being a yes, no, like how can we make this fit? Because my concern would be, because we have so many small bungalows, anything other than that is going to be a no, that doesn't fit. So just like what, Bernie had mentioned, the types of housing where you look at it and you don't notice that it's 4 units. Like if there's a way to have some things that still somewhat look like Inglewood in terms of the examples, so we don't just get a resounding no.
Good tip. Thank you. Although sometimes the resounding no is in there for a reason, even though we know we're going to get it. I'll just qualify that.
Okay, seeing no other questions, shall we call it a wrap for the evening? Okay, that was a great discussion, everybody. I appreciate it. And as always, if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. Otherwise, we'll see you on December 7th.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks.
Good night.
night.
Thanks.
Thank you.